All right. I got it. Okay. Uh, Let a few more people come on. All right. Good morning, everyone. Uh, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, uh, my name is Dennis Lloyd, and along with my family, and we are descendants of Cuba, uh, Tony, and Darby Vassal, who were enslaved by the founders of the royal family, who were enslaved by the royal family, the family that endowed the first law professorship at Harvard University, which eventually became Harvard Law School. So we're very excited to be here this morning, and we have a very, very compelling and interesting presentation this morning, and we are so happy to have Asia Lambs, who will speak on the subject of the curating of enslaved people at remains of slave individuals at Harvard's Peabody Museum. But before we introduce Asia formally, I just like to introduce my daughter, who will, as most of you know anyway, who will give us an update on any announcements that we have. Egypt.
Hi, good morning, Dad.
Hey, honey.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to invite everyone who is joining us for the first time to please enter your name in the chat, your email address, where you are from, organization name, and affiliate organization if appropriate, so we can join. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to let everybody know on May 17th, there will be an inaugural Marcus and Amy Garvey annual lecture featuring Paula Paris. And this event recognizes St. Augustine's role in the historic Pan-Africanist UNI movement founded by Marcus Garvey and Amy Garvey in 1914. Paula Parrish, a public historian with decades of service to communities across Cambridge, will deliver the first lecture in this new yearly tradition, and it will be held Wednesday, May 17th at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at St. Augustine Church at 137 Alston Street in Cambridge. I will put the link for you to register for the event. It is free in the chat, so everyone can get more information about that, and please plan to attend. I do also have a job announcement. Harvard University is currently hiring 6 research fellows to do archival research for evidence of enslaved individuals who labored on Harvard's campus or who were enslaved by Harvard leadership, faculty, or staff. And I will actually put this information in the chat. They're looking for 6 research fellowships to do archival research. And I will also put that information in the chat. We will be putting this on our website as well and the newsletter. And Dad, that is all the announcements I have today, and back to you.
Okay. Well, again, it's good to see everybody, people I haven't seen in a while. And we are very excited today. Asia Lands is a postdoctoral researcher currently at Harvard University. And her topic today that she will be talking about is investigating the remains of Black people curated at Harvard Peabody Museum. Asia comes to us with a vast amount of preparation, in addition to being a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University. She is a graduate of, earned a PhD at Syracuse University. She's worked on a number of projects and is also interested in the ethics of museums and their collections. And I hope you've had a chance to read her bio and newsletter, but I would like to start by introducing Asia Lands. Good morning, Asia.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to be able to share some of my work I've been doing at Harvard. So actually, I'm going to talk about the two projects I've been working on at Harvard that have to do with Harvard and the legacy of slavery, and then also with the steering committee on human remains. So let me just start sharing my screen, and we will get started. Okay, I'll just switch the view. Okay, so I've kind of made it a bit broader, what I'm going to talk about, because I'm so excited to be able to talk to interested folks in the Cambridge area, because more people need to know about I think about, like, some of the projects we're doing, and I would like more people to be involved and interested in the initiatives that Harvard's undertaking in Cambridge that should be more community oriented. In my opinion. And so I will also make the disclaimer, I speak for myself, not for the university. This is my perspective on the work that I've been doing here. I will also give a kind of a content warning. There is one picture that has human skeletal remains. They are not of the ancestors in question. So I will just let you know that's towards the end of the presentation. So again, I've been working on two projects here, mapping postmortem segregation with Harvard and legacy of slavery, and then the Black ancestors in the Peabody with the steering committee on human remains. So I've been at Harvard, I'm finishing up my second year, and I'll be moving on, but I'll still be working on these projects. So if you have like questions or want to get involved, please reach out to me. It'd be really wonderful. And I can share my email in the chat, or you can just find me on the website. So I'm part of the Inequality in America initiative. So I'll jump right in. Also, this QR code should work, so you can see the link to our project proposal through Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. I'd love you to take a look. So if I'm sure that most of you here have heard of, if you've been at these meetings, have seen the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, and perhaps some folks talked who were affiliated with it. But so the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery is focused on, the university's history and interactions with enslaved individuals, who really played an important role in the university when it was first founded, and they've kind of been, as we know, erased from the landscape in many ways, or written out of or ignored in our history. And so this initiative is drawing attention to Harvard's role and ties to slavery and how the institution profited off of it. And so when I landed here at Harvard, I met some of the other archaeologists in the program, and it was Dr. Jason in particular who was very interested in Cambridge's old burying ground, and I'll show you some images from there in just a moment. And the marked graves of enslaved people who had ties to folks who had ties to Harvard. And so what's interesting is my collaborator is what we call sort of a prehistoric archaeologist. I actually do historical archaeology and bioarcheology, so I work, on folks, the African diaspora, specifically in the United States. And so he does landscape archaeology. He had mapped the cemetery, and he's like, there's something here. I just, don't have the background. So we've been working on this together. And so I've kind of been interested in, the experience of enslavement in New England, which, as many of you likely know, there's a lot of myths about it, I would say. So I want to start with, one of these groundbreaking works on enslavement in New England by Lorenzo J. Green in 1942. He argued that there was, because of the intimate association of masters and slaves in New England, and they were living in close proximity to their enslavers oftentimes, made for kinder treatment of slaves. And as many of us know, this is absolutely not true. But New England and the North in general often get away with this sort of myth of slavery of not being as large a part of the economy or being kinder and gentler. So most of my dissertation research took place in New York State. And I can tell you that is absolutely not the case. And in fact, living in such close proximity to enslavers, being in these tight spaces means you're constantly under surveillance. And there was an added risk for women in particular. And so we've been thinking about how we can, delve into these sorts of issues with Harvard and the legacy of slavery, and from our perspective as archaeologists. And so we're actually doing this with the Cambridge Old Burying Ground indicated on this map here in red. So we have an overlay of sort of what Cambridge was. It's founded as Newtown in 1630, renamed in 1638 for Cambridge in England. And we have the burying ground from, when the town first starts. As it looks today, right next to the two churches there. And this is sort of an overview of what the cemetery looks like. Hopefully, if you're in the Cambridge area, maybe you've been to it or walked past it, right by Garden Street. And what's really interesting about the cemetery is that, so it goes along with First Church in Cambridge, and this is where you're burying everyone. And there's a lot of folks with ties to Harvard, of course, who are buried in this cemetery. And something I would really like to point out is the overall really great preservation of this space. So if you're familiar with a lot of the, issues going on around preserving Black burial grounds, historically Black burial grounds, they're often destroyed. Urban renewal, highways are a huge one. Perhaps you've heard of the African burial ground in New York City, wherein the federal building was being built right where there was a massive historic Black cemetery. Our spaces are often not protected. I would also like to throw in a pitch, if you're not aware, that an African American Burial Ground Act did pass in the federal budget. And so they're going to be allocating only $3 million to the National Park Service to be giving out to folks who are trying to preserve and document these spaces. So if you know of Black burying grounds, I just want you to be aware of that, side note. But so this space, I think, is particularly interesting because most of the people with these marked graves are indeed white folks who were considered very important to Cambridge. And so overall, in the United States, this is a space that's going to be protected. We're never going to mess with these sorts of sacred spaces. And from the perspective of mortuary archaeology, burial grounds are really, interesting sites because they provide insight into how communities memorialize folks, religious views, and aspects of social identity. And so what you can see is that how people are treated in death actually can reflect socioeconomic status, gender, and ethnicity. And there's often this focus on making permanent status. And so this could be getting a huge tombstone and making sure that you know how important this person was in life, and it's something the living must pass by and always be reminded of this person. Or it could be, no marker at all, or very small markers, which we'll talk about. And so the old burying ground and many of these old, colonial cemeteries in New England are very interesting because they are preserved. And if you look at the graves, you will still every now and then find these marked graves of enslaved people. And so we're using this as our sort of entry point to consider, how slavery, acted in New England, how we can put Black people and enslaved people back on the landscape, but also how we can, really consider the intersections of being a Black woman who was enslaved in colonial New England. So this is just an overview that was made in GIS, Geographical Information Systems, that my collaborator made. And so what we've done is we've actually gone through and, looked at all the dates on these headstones and burials and sort of mapped them out year by year. So we're going to start in 1714. And this is what the burial space would have looked like then. So just getting this general overview of where most folks were buried and where the graves are. And the reason we're starting in 1714 is Cicely's headstone. So Cicely, the headstone reads, "Here lies the body of Cicely, a Negro, late servant to Reverend Mr. William Brattle. She died April 8th, 1714, being 13 years old." And so what's interesting is, first off, that she was, the thing about these gravestones, let's consider what's written here. Body of Cicely, a Negro. So in death, it's always marked. Late servant. Servant is a euphemism for a slave in New England. So she's, in perpetual servitude is sort of what they're trying to do with this gravestone. And what is very important to note is that her enslaver would have paid for this gravestone. For the most part, the bodies of Black folks, if they're being buried, the United States has a long history of sort of regulating funerary practices for people who were Black and enslaved, how many people could attend. They really restrict how we can mourn our dead, which is very important. I want you to keep this in mind as I go through, and especially when I start talking about our ancestors who are held in the Peabody Museum. That a lot of this is about mourning work. And I would like to make a pitch for reading the work of Christina Sharp, In the Wake, a really wonderful book that I've been, going back to again and again to try to kind of grapple with the emotion of working with these sorts of things. So we have a 13-year-old woman named Cicely, dying in 1714. Her grave is actually likely the oldest marked grave of a Black person in North America, and it's right here in Cambridge. So what's interesting, if you look at this map, here's Cicely marked in red and where she died in 1714. You will notice that she's on the outskirts of the cemetery, the very edge of where they're actually burying folks at the time. And for a long time, archaeologists have studied burials, starting with one of our foremost, a historical archaeologist back in the day, Ian Hodder, who really argued you could make societal interpretations by studying burials, burial rituals, and how we do them. They can distort or obscure certain social relationships. But then if you look at burial differentiation, it actually can accurately reflect social differentiation. And so in the case of Cicely being buried here, we might be like, oh, wait, doesn't this mean that she was actually valued as a person and maybe treated as an equal? However, the placement of her burial on the outskirts of the cemetery as it was at the time, the size of her gravestone, and again, that epitaph actually reveals how she was marginalized in life and in death. So the burial places of enslaved individuals are often spatially separated from those of white people. And even if you're being buried in the same sort of general space, the same overall burying ground, you're going to put, Black people, people of color, people considered outsiders on the edges. So they're not truly part of these communities. And then as this, there's these wonderful publications in the, oh gosh, now I'm blanking on the name of the journal. It was a small regional journal. I think it was called, it might have just been called Burials. But there's a lot of work by a scholar named Angelica Kruger-Kalula. And she argues, the memorials offered white patrons the last opportunity to define Black identities. Okay, and so this is really important. Again, we are being defined by someone else, okay? The other thing that's important to note is that the stone markers being used in these spaces are actually very costly, engravings being priced by the letter. And so even if, poorer folks, Black people, people of color, we also know that there were Indian servants, quote unquote, which meant indigenous people were enslaved as well. They likely used perishable materials, such as wood. We know that in the case of the African diaspora, it's common to decorate graves with wood, shells, pottery. And so if there are other Black folks buried in many of these spaces, they're likely no longer marked. The other thing that's important to note is that the Brattles, who hopefully you also recognize this name all over Cambridge, William Brattle actually served as the minister at First Congregational, where Harvard students and faculty were required to attend services when the college was from the college's founding until the early 19th century. So Brattle has ties to Harvard. He was a tutor, a fellow, a treasurer. so Brattle Street, Brattle Square, all named for him. And of course, he marks that he owned Sicily on her gravestone. And yet, if the argument or the idea was that, you know, Black people living in close proximity to their white enslavers made them part of the family, then why isn't she buried with the rest of the Brattle family, who are all over in this other area marked in red? So then we're going to jump forward a bit to the cemetery pictured in 1741. So again, we still have Sicily and the Brattles marked right here on this overall slide, but there's more burials. Sicily's still pretty much on the outskirts of the cemetery, but now she's been joined by Jane. So Jane, and her gravestone reads, a Negro servant to Andrew Boardman, Esquire, died March 11th, 1740, ages 22 years and 3 months. So another very young Black woman whose enslaver has chosen to memorialize her in this space. And you can see this, our 3D rendering here. We're also really interested in preservation and trying to document these markers. So I'd love to talk about that as well afterwards. And so you can see here, Jane labeled in blue, Jane's near Sicily, right on the edges, even though they did not overlap in life. And just like Sicily, Jane is very far from the Boardmans who enslaved her. Andrew Boardman was actually the steward of Harvard College in the early years, and it was a very important role. It meant that they oversaw staff, collected money from the students, paid a lot of the college's bills. And so Harvard stewards are very important. Quite a few of them did enslave people, have human property, including Andrew Boardman. So again, we have these ties to Harvard and legacy of slavery. What's interesting, however, is that we know that many other folks with ties to Harvard enslaved people. So our question kind of in this research project, and on top of, you know, this sort of more traditional mortuary archaeology, is where is everyone else buried if this was for quite a while the only burying ground in use? The other thing I would like to point out, just if we're talking about, you know, Jane and Sicily specifically, and how Black women would have navigated this landscape, is, you know, many households in New England had, you know, only a few slaves at a time. And this idea that they're integrated into the homes is absolutely, you know, not you know, true. They're still not given their own space. I mean, it was not uncommon for enslaved people to say, sleep in the kitchen. But this also meant that you never had privacy. And I really want to emphasize this. A large part of, you know, the archaeology of enslavement focuses on surveillance. And also it means that you were taken from your own family oftentimes. You're not being integrated into this family. The other thing we have to add to this is the role of gender. And so, you know, we have women of color and a lot of things that have been said about us and our bodies. And so there's always the risk of sexual violence. There's always this, the history of, you know, using enslaved women in order to reproduce more property. So there's a lot of questions about why, you know, why did they choose to, you know, memorialize Jane and Sicily? And I've talked about this with many people. It's like, oh, maybe they were their illegitimate child. Maybe they were their, you know, some sort of, you know, mistress. And I'm using this loosely because we can't get fully into the politics of like consent and such. But, you know, there's questions as to why these two young girls, young girl and young woman, were actually memorialized. So part of my research, because it is, and I'm going to talk about this, very emotionally stressful and draining, I like to try to put in bits of Black livingness, if you will. And this comes from the scholarship of Catherine McKittrick. And it's also really important because I work in spaces of death that I don't want to reduce the entire Black experience to suffering and death, but I want to think of the creative things that we make despite these sorts of histories. And so this poem by Rita Dove that I came across that I really love is based on Belinda Sutton, who was enslaved by the royals and successfully sues for reparations in 1783. This is, also a really important, from 1781 to 1783, we have these three cases known today as the Quock Walker case that abolished slavery in the state. But what I think is really interesting here is this poem, using words from from Belinda's petition, but they point out, I'm Belinda, an African, since the age of 12, a slave. And I will not take too much of your time, but to plead and place my appreciable life unto the fathers of this nation. And it's fascinating how she, uses the language of this petition and puts it into this poetry, and talks about sort of the hypocrisy of the United States, but also really emphasizing that enslavement, one of the biggest lasting legacies we're dealing with, again, to use this idea of the wake coming from Christina Sharp, is that you make enslaved people non-humans. You take us away from our family. And I often find when I'm looking at historical records, you'll see phrases like no kin, no friends, no family. You sever these ties and try to make it so that we are sort of like these stateless, placeless, unknown people, unknowable people. And this is really important moving forward in my work when I talk about, working with skeletal remains, because, this comes back to haunt us when we're trying to find folks who might return our ancestors to, or who might care for them. So the final part of this Old Burying Ground project that I really want to emphasize, because we just, finished this up, we're processing data, and I'm so excited. We did ground penetrating radar in the space. And what that is sort of like, it's putting some waves into the ground, completely non-destructive, and it shows disturbances. So it's often used to find unmarked burials. So in this picture here, I'm sorry if you can't see it very well, there's the large black square in the upper left is the huge space that we just surveyed, results forthcoming. And then there's in the smaller corner down on the right was the test area we did. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of data that's been generated from that. So again, a zoom in of our control area of this test area. It takes a lot of, we've flown multiple drones and such over the space, done a lot of mapping, so that we can mark these, where the gravestones are and where people are supposed to be buried. The thing about ground penetrating radar is this will show, there are many, many different layers. So this is basically just a slice of one layer in the subsurface. And so our ground penetrating radar expert extraordinaire, Andrew Baer, who's a graduate student in the department, is currently processing this data for us so that we can put all the layers together and see burials. And basically what you're doing by putting all these layers together and having many different slices is that you can see the burials at different depths. But if you look in this slide, there are some really interesting little things, like you see these little spots of white, like, okay, there's some disturbances in this layer that look like probably burials. And so we've done this in the large swath of the cemetery over by Jane and Sicily, in hopes of finding unmarked burials that likely belong to other enslaved people, other Black people. The other thing I should note actually is near Jane and Sicily, we also have the graves of the Lennoxes, who were free Black people. Okay, so this really points to having a sort of Negro burying ground section in the cemetery, which is actually, completely normal during this time. So now I'm going to jump to sort of my next project, although I view these as very interrelated, my time here at Harvard, is the human remains in university collections. And so I want to also make a pitch that this report came out last fall and anyone can access it. And I would really, really like you to, because people need to know this. And so far I've only been contacted by one sort of interested descendant group, but it's turning out to be this really wonderful relationship. So the reason this is public and why it should be public is so that this information is out there. And one of my biggest pushes that I've been, saying to these committees I'm working with is we need to be transparent, because for so long museums have sort of hidden their collections, and we've damaged the trust that the community and, you know, general public has in us, especially for people of color, for Indigenous people. You know, there are a lot of human remains in museums. We really need to think about who should be mourning them and where they belong, because the museum is not a proper resting place in many cases for folks. So I just want to point to this, you know, report, the contents. I'll talk a little bit about some of them and some of my contributions to this. But first, I would like to explain, first off, why do we have skeletons in the first place? This is one of the questions I get asked most frequently in my research. Why do these museums and universities have human remains? So I'm going to start out like the way I start many of my presentations, screaming enraged about Alois Hrlička, who we consider the father of American physical anthropology. So I'm actually trained in physical anthropology, although we've switched the name to biological anthropology in hopes of distancing ourselves from this history. Basically, Hrlička, he's drawing on the work of a lot of, you know, his predecessors, who are all going to be European and Euro-American white men. But he kind of really synthesizes physical anthropology, professionalizes it here in the United States. He founds our first professional organization, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, which still exists to this day. I'm a member of it, but it's now the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. But so early physical anthropology is really tied to, like most anthropology, tied to colonialism. And in physical anthropology in particular is tied to the rapidly expanding medical field here in the United States. And Hrlička defines it as that part of the science which occupies itself with the body and its functions, investigating their differences is very key. He often brings up differences. The way he sets physical anthropology apart from, say, anatomy or other branches of, say, medicine or related fields is that he argues that physical anthropologists are focused on comparisons. The comparisons he's interested in, comparing everyone to what he considers to be normal, typically a normal white man. And so the thing is, to do this sort of work, you need bodies. You need bodies to take measurements, and then you're going to look for differences that can somehow be quantified with these measurements. And then you're going to make arguments. In Hrlička's case, he's going to be arguing for the inferiority of pretty much anyone who he doesn't consider a good white person. One of his best known publications is The Old Americans. So he was looking at like these sorts of long-standing families of colonizers and arguing for how they were superior, of better stock. There's also this real concern with sort of the population of the United States somehow declining. Becoming degeneration. Sorry, there's this worry about degeneration. And this actually ties into early eugenics, so the science of race improvement that is, you know, what causes the Holocaust. And in fact, Hrlička said that eugenics was applied anthropology. So the thing is, again, to do all of this, you need bodies. So oftentimes physical anthropologists would work closely with anatomists and medical schools so that they had access to cadavers, people who were being dissected for science. They were really interested in keeping the bones. The other thing is, Hrlička also worked with living people. So he did a ton of work for New York State, working in the insane asylums at the time, because inmates have no say in what happens to them. And he was really interested in trying to talk about people who were abnormal, who had, you know, the illnesses you would have caused mania, idiocy, like, you know, a lot of these really offensive and ableist things come out of anthropology, not just racism. But when it comes to race, a lot of this ties into early phrenology, or this sort of idea that you could measure people or look at their bodily features and somehow link it to their personality, to their traits, to their intelligence. A huge part of it's going to focus on the skull and measurements of cranial capacity. So if you're familiar with Dr. Morton, who was at the University of Pennsylvania, that has been in the spotlight a lot recently because the Penn Museum is not doing right by those remains. But Morton was an early skull doctor, as Michael Blakey refers to them, who collected crania from all over the world, measured cranial capacity, and then argued that brain size was linked to intelligence. Therefore, the smaller your brain size, essentially the dumber you are. And of course, he's going to be putting Black people at the bottom of that hierarchy. So here at Harvard, we have the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, founded in 1877. And so it was actually, funded, the money was given in 1866 by philanthropist George Peabody. And he wanted to fund a place for the study of anthropology, which was still a pretty new discipline in the mid 1800s. So again, remember, Herlichka doesn't come along until he officially creates the AAPA, the association, in 1917. So there's still a gap in here where anthropology is trying to sort of find its footing. And Harvard was a really important university for this. And so what I find fascinating now, so this is a picture of Peabody closer to its founding, not what it looked like today, but it's still in its original building. And the Peabody is trying to change its image and trying to do what's correct. And so they specifically say on their website that they're also welcoming Indigenous communities and the general public, because the Peabody has tens of thousands of human remains in it that have been brought there by various curators and researchers and anthropologists over the years. Many of them are Indigenous Americans who fall under NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which means that they are supposed to be being returned to their descendant groups. The problem is NAGPRA has a lot of loopholes. And so if you say that you can't find an appropriate descendant, sort of lineal descendant tribe, there were a lot of loopholes to say there was no one to return it to. But again, this is based on that sort of idea of having to have this one way of finding descendants, which also affects Black people. Again, we've been treated in such a way that we can't trace our histories back. And so we have to think of other ways of finding descendant groups, or as archaeologist Dr. Jennifer Lupu proposes, ethical stakeholders, people who share a similar social position with the folks being researched, with the people in question. So again, to return to the African burial ground in New York, the reason that project was saved, really, it's taken over, it's brought to Howard University, a historically Black university, is because living Black people in New York City said no. Whether or not we are, related by blood, those people are our ancestors. We are their descendant community. Michael Blakey comes up with this term, descendant community. And so these Black people should be the ones making these choices, because they're the ones who are mourning them. They're the ones who are caring for them. And they're the ones who share this similar position today with these people in the past. So in 2020, the Peabody Museum documents the presence of 15 individuals of African descent who were alive, possibly around the time of enslavement. The number is often put at 19 because there's also 4 folks from Brazil. Those people are actually going home eventually. That's being worked out. So this sort of comes out of, we have Black Lives Matter. We have a lot of, things, people realizing that there are Black ancestors in these collections. And what I'd like to stress is that there's no federal legislation making anyone do this, okay? And people really weren't, even when it comes to NAGPRA, a lot of anthropologists were really resistant when that passed in 1990. And if it wasn't passed at the federal level, they were never going to part with those ancestors. So I strongly support federal legislation that would extend not only to just trying to protect our grave sites, but getting our ancestors out of these museums, where for so long they've been used to, take measurements of them and argue for our inferiority or us being less than human. So these individuals who were enslaved or likely to have been enslaved, who are identified, they come to the Peabody. Some of them may have been local to Boston and Cambridge. We have a few individuals who came from Richmond, Virginia. Then we have folks from St. Louis, Missouri, Louisiana, Delaware, Oklahoma, Mississippi. These are just, some of the places they came from. And what I'd like to really emphasize is that what I've been, working on with folks on these committees is saying it's about place, and it's about the people in those places who will mourn them and who will lay them to rest. And I'd also like to say that I really argue that institutions we need to give up control. A lot of universities, institutions, museums don't like doing that, but the Peabody Museum is not the proper steward of these remains. And I often get pushback where they're like, well, we wouldn't know what, this deceased person would have wanted. And I'm like, well, I'm fairly positive they wouldn't have wanted to be put in this museum. I'm fairly positive they wouldn't want to be so far from, whatever home and community they maybe had. And really, like, those sorts of concerns make this work very difficult. I'm like, so what does that mean? You think they should just stay languishing in this museum? Other thing is most of what we do for the dead is actually for the living. So even to return to the cemetery, to this burial ground, to how we make monuments, to mourning, again, it's really about the living and how we're processing loss. So I would like to talk just really quickly about a couple of the folks, and they're mentioned in the report. So one of the individuals who has really stuck with me since I've met him is a cranium, again, just a skull and it's described as a Negro named Giles, who was the slave of General Peyton of Richmond, murdered his overseer while at work in the field, and was executed at Richmond. And so when I did some digging in, newspapers.com, I find the runaway slave ad for Giles. And what I want to really point out here, so this is in 1847, he's supposedly murdered Thomas B. Goodman, his overseer, and he goes on the run. He absconds from what was called West Ham Cottage. That was the plantation. Now, where it was, the University of Richmond is right on top. And what I want to emphasize here is this focus on appearance. He's unusually large and athletic young man, quite black with fine teeth. And the thing is, when you look at these runaway ads, they're always trying to talk about things that a person can't change about their appearance, something they can't hide. And I started doing research after I, go into the Peabody collections and I see Giles and I meet him. I'd like to point out that a major part of my research in this was I didn't take a single measurement. I was looking at these ancestors, hoping to find things that would help me identify them or learn more about their stories. And the first thing that stood out to me when I met Giles was his teeth, which as a bioarchaeologist, I was like, how are his teeth so perfect? And if you look at a lot of, human remains like I do from the colonial era and after, and, early American history, teeth are some of the, the things that go with our diets. His teeth were beautiful, but also he was likely very young. They think he was probably around 20. But something that they don't mention in this is that if you look at Giles's teeth, he has the slight start of what we call a pipe facet, which means he would smoke a tobacco pipe. And that tells me something that Giles, it gives me a hint of something he enjoyed while he was alive. That makes this work at least slightly more bearable for me. Because then I find this description of Giles's execution, where I would like to point out, they say he's very black, large head, broad, heavy features, appearance indicating but little intelligence. This is the sort of thing, this is in 1847, but these are the traits that people like Samuel Morton go on to quantify, and Alice Herlichka. They go on to try to measure these and make it real. And people are treated very poorly because of that. We're still dealing with the ramifications of this sort of race science. They argue that he shows stoic indifference, that proves he's fit for the gallows. And, when he's looking out at the crowd, every now and then he would see one of his acquaintances. And this also stands out to me. He had people there for him. There were people at this execution who went there and they witnessed it, but they were there for him. And to me, again, there's something there. There were people who mourned him. Giles was cared about. He was loved. And so again, him being in the Peabody, just his skull, of course, because that's all that Jeffries Wyman, who probably likely dissected Giles, brought with him. So the other point is that it was very difficult to get bodies for dissection for medical schools during this time period. One of the only legal sources, because most people turned to grave robbing, which Jeffries Wyman's students did participate in when he was down in Richmond before he returns to Cambridge. You could get bodies from criminals. They were fit for dissection. And so Wyman likely dissected Giles himself, and he brings his cranium with him. This is the case for two other crania of ancestors that we have in the Peabody who came with Jeffries Wyman from Richmond. So the other one, and this is where I was like, okay, there's some blurry human remains. The other thing I want to talk about is just very briefly conclude with, just because someone was not enslaved, though, they still need to be returned. Okay, like none of these Black ancestors belong in the Peabody. So there's one individual who actually came from a very well-known skeletal collection that's at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Terry Collection, which was made from dissected individuals who were dissected at the Washington University in St. Louis. And so there was a little bit of information about Abron is his name, and he's a complete skeleton who has, debilitating pathology. He had an injury to his head that, based on when I found his death certificate, likely caused part of his body to be paralyzed. Abron, based on his death certificate, was born in 1872, likely. It says he was born June 16th, 1872. And again, it mentions this injury on his death certificate where I'm like, yes, these are his remains. But my question would be, just because he wasn't enslaved and we can rule out he wasn't enslaved, like, does that mean he belongs here? And the answer is no. And even so, these folks pictured here, Mildred Trotter on the left and William Howells on the right. Howells, who was at Harvard. Howells, I found the correspondence, wrote to Trotter and said he needed more examples of African Americans. So she sent him 2 complete skeletons from her collection, which at the time was still in St. Louis. Eventually it goes to the Smithsonian in DC. So she just sent him a couple of Black folk skeletons, and they're still here. The other man I've not been able to identify yet, because that's going to take flipping through actual death certificates to see if I see another body listed as going to the university, because they didn't mention anything about his potential name at all. And so the other thing, the reason I picked these pictures, also when you look for pictures of like Trotter and Howells, you'll often find them holding bones, because that's just how they took pictures then. Again, like they're measuring race. So Trotter, I often come across her articles where she was like looking at just what we call non-metric variation. So even like some little holes that we get in our bones and such that don't really indicate something, trying to link them to race, okay? And this is taking place, into the, up into, she's, working in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. So this race science is still with us. And so I don't necessarily have a conclusion to this, but I wanted to talk with people because first off, I just want people to know that this is here and this is what I've been working on, but also what do, folks think should be done? I'm so excited to be here with folks like Dennis in Egypt who can, trace themselves back to, Darby and Cuba Vassal. Like, what do you think of, the bodies of enslaved people who may have been from the area? What do you think about the cemetery? What do you think about preserving these spaces? And, how public outreach should be done? So I'll end it there. I definitely went longer than I wanted to, I'm sorry. But yes, I'd really love comments and questions and to talk about this further.
Asia, thank you very, very much. And I'm sure there are some questions because that was a very interesting presentation. And Egypt, do you have any questions that were in? And thank you. Yes, thank you very, very, very much.
Yes, Asia, that was amazing, amazing. Yes, we do have some great questions in the chat. The first question is from Brian Jones. The question is that marginal placement consistent with the other locations of burials on this site that you was displaying?
So if you mean like, all right, there's a couple, so let me just back up. So if you go into the site now, Jane and Cicely are still kind of on the edge. Their burial stones are still like out, there's nothing around them. But based on the burial density in other parts of the burying ground, we're like, there's most likely other people buried here. So that's what our ground penetrating radar will hopefully tell us. The other thing that's interesting about the old burying ground is, so you have Jane and Cicely, you have the Lennoxes, who we know are free Black folks. There's a large monument that was put in I want to say the 1830s. I could be wrong. It's put in much later, and it's a monument to Black Revolutionary like war soldiers. And so it's like, oh, is there some community history here, like that folks at one point knew there were Black people buried in this area, maybe? The other thing is that when you go further back towards what now is like the very edge of the fence, those folks who even have marked graves, they're all outsiders. They weren't local to Cambridge. So there's like a sea captain who happened to die here. So that's really consistent with the spatial organization of cemeteries, where you're putting outsiders or people you don't consider to be part of the community around the edges. So again, Andrew is still processing that data. So hopefully mid-June, we're going to know about the unmarked burials. I will say that like we spent the whole day out there, and I had have to drag this machine across the ground, and I was holding this computer, and I was complaining the whole time because I love to complain. But it looks like I was like, there were times, because I haven't done ground penetrating radar myself. This was the first time. And there were times where it was like, that looks like there might be a burial there. And I was like, yes, we're going to find out. Like, I'm positive there's going to be a lot of unmarked burials there. I mean, I'm sure. But now we'll just have the proof of it. And then we're still working on how we're going to like disseminate that information. So we have our website and stuff. So we really, yeah, we want people to know about this project again. Yeah.
Thank you. Kate Ryan has a great question. She wants to know, is there anything we can do to get Harvard to repatriate these remains? Letters, yes, emails, rallies, etc.
So I again encourage you to look at the report. So that's like freely available if you look up the Harvard report on human remains. So that initial committee was chaired by Dr. Evelyn Hammonds, who's a wonderful person. I've been really fortunate to work and learn from her while I've been here. And the unanimous recommendation is that no, they don't belong here. Now, the difficulty is, here's the thing it's very hard, and this is what I work on, this is like what my dissertation was, this is what I'm going to be going back to likely at the Smithsonian. When we want to repatriate these sorts of remains, how do we do it? And I think that's what I've kind of been hinting at, is like, we are like, for some people, if you have names and you can find them on documents, yes, we may be able to find lineal descendants. But because of the history of slavery, we sort of have what we might refer to as like the 1870 wall of silence, that, before that, you're not finding people in these sorts of archives. And so it's really difficult to find a lineal descendant. My argument, going off the work of Michael Blakey, who again was these kind of pioneers, African-American bioarcheology and the African burial ground, is that we need to look for what he calls descendant communities. Okay, so if we have a general idea about where someone was from, and this, especially places like Richmond, where there's this rich Black history, and there's a lot of folks who are interested in preserving it. There's already projects related to these sorts of things. Those are the people that we need to be making contact with and reaching out to. So another concern that often comes up that I've talked about a lot with the folks on these committees is, how would you want to be told that the Peabody has like your ancestor's skull or something? Sorry, as my dog barks. Hey, stop it. So the thing is, I had this really wonderful conversation with another Black historian at McGill, and why am I blanking on her name? Her first name's Melissa, but she pointed out that, like, I mean, so my way working through this was, we already have folks who are interested in history. So, you know, when I finally was introduced to Dennis in Egypt, it's like, okay, they're aware of this, they're interested in this. You know, there are plenty of people who are kind of out there doing the work already and understand, like, the sort of emotional work, who might be good people to have first steps in talking with. However, Melissa made this great point where she's like, well, if you don't get it out there, like, you're not even giving us the option to decide if we want to be involved. And she's like, and that's really paternalistic in what people have been doing to Black people in this country, in the Americas, for centuries. And that really got me thinking. And that's, again, why I really think we need to have more, like, forward facing, you know, publicly accessible things, whether it be like an exhibition or an art, like something, so that, you know, interested people or people who would be drawn to these activities would, you know, be able to get in touch with us, or be like, hey, you know, I can train, or I can trace my ancestors back to these sorts of areas. So again, a lot of my work has been based on place. And I would also like to emphasize that it takes a lot of time and effort. And that's why people don't want to do it, because it's time, it's effort, it's not easy. You have to know how to navigate archives and museum archives, and, you know, how to read, you know, and try to find Black people reading against the archival grain, is what we often say. And a lot of places don't want to put the money or the effort into it. So that's the other issue. And so I've been really working on, like, going off of these little notes of where these ancestors' bodies came from, and kind of, you know, like, working backward, trying to find the place that they may have come from. But it's going to be case by case. And again, I really want to emphasize that.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Asia. I am going to, Dr. Robert Bellinger has a question. I see he has his hand raised up. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Asia, thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. It was informative. I have two quick questions or comments. One, I'm doing work myself here in the town of Lexington, trying to figure out where the African Americans from the colonial area were buried. I believe they were in the church cemetery, but there is no record of that. I've been through church records, I've looked around. There doesn't seem to be a clear edge where there are unmarked graves, there are no headstones, and I don't have the resources of Harvard to do GPR and all of that. So do you have any suggestions for resources? And the second comment is that you may want to link up with African American genealogical groups, like the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, which does have a branch in Richmond, because these are folks who have been working beyond that 1870 wall and can probably give you some information or help you with information, such as the wonderful find you had on Giles, and which is really fascinating for me. It was great to see that description.
So there is, I would start with, there's an entire, I don't know if you're familiar with the Black Cemetery Network. So there's this organization called the Black Cemetery Network, and it's made up of people who are just devoting their time to finding these sites and trying to document them. So I would look there. The other thing is, depending on, like, the layout of Lexington at the time, like, it's possible that individuals, like enslaved people, were just buried in some part of the plantations themselves and not in the proper, like, church area. Because the thing is that in most church records that the places that I've been around where there's church records and they had a segregated space for Black folks, it is mentioned in the church records, which kind of makes me think that maybe they're not buried there. Like, it seems strange that there would be no mention of ever burying, like, because when you look at the records, it will often say, like, there will be the mark, like, Negro, like so-and-so, or like slave, free, like free man, person, like, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm not entirely Sure. My other question would be if you're affiliated like with a university, if there's so the thing is, yes, Harvard is obnoxious amounts of money. But if there are local archaeologists, even at other universities, who do that sort of work, like where are the kind of people who are like, yes, let's go to ground penetrating radar? I mean, if they have the equipment already, then it's just literally the cost of labor, which shouldn't cost anything if you're being a good archaeologist and have a project you're interested in. So yeah, I mean, I feel like there are other like avenues you could take and maybe like consider looking. The other thing, sorry, before I forget, is if you can find historic maps. So that's oftentimes there's someone who I work with, Elizabeth Mead, and again, this is New York City, but she has marked out all of the Black burial grounds she could find by going through old maps, because they slowly get erased from the landscape. So if there was a dedicated burying ground for Black people, it probably is marked on a map somewhere.
I've looked at maps and they are listed in church records because many of them had to join the church, because they felt that was the best way to help maintain control. But and some of their deaths are listed in the Reverend's journal. But where the burials were when they had, is not there. So it's not clear where they are.
Weird.
So it's an interesting kind of conundrum.
Yeah, I would maybe reach out to some of the folks at the Black Cemetery Network and see if like if someone else there has encountered that sort of thing.
Okay.
Might help. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bellinger. Dr. Barbara Brown has a question for you, Asia. Dr. Brown, would you like to unmute yourself? There you go.
First of all, thank you. I couldn't write fast enough for everything you said, so I'm looking forward to seeing the recording again and passing it on to people in Brookline who are doing research on the same problem that Bob Bellinger has, which is where are they buried? And my question actually is about the two gravestones that were found in the cemetery next to the church. And that is, it's unusual for there to be gravestones. And I understand totally that that didn't make them less enslaved or made them happy people. But yet there has to be some reason why a gravestone was chosen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of like where like as soon as someone was like, brought me over there and was like, look at these gravestones, I was like, what on earth? But, so again, I have to take a step back. So a lot of my research, again, I work as a bioarcheologist mainly. So I work with actual human skeletal remains that someone's already stolen from somewhere. And I'm like, oh, why did you do this? But one of the difficulties of doing this sort of work is, again, because of the history of how Black people and Black women in particular have been treated in this country. I only have, I guess, ideas and thoughts and theories that to me are, again, challenge this narrative of slavery being gentler, kinder in New England. I'm like, why would someone like Brattle decide he's going to just, of all the people he enslaved throughout his lifetime, only, pay for a gravestone for this one young woman? Okay. Things that come to mind for me are like, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. There's this really dark history there, and it maybe it's not something like that. I mean, it's still awful. You still enslaved someone and they still died enslaved, and you're marking them as a slave upon death. So like, no matter what, there's that. But I was like, oh, could it be like an illegitimate child? Could it be someone who's treated as like a concubine or something? Like it's really the fact that they're women that stands out to me, because there are other marked graves, especially in New England, and there are some for other women, but it's usually like I know there's one that was like elderly woman who lived a very long time. So it was like, oh, she must deserve a grave because she, was so elderly and so well known to this family or something, And there's a lot for, enslaved men. And they talk about how they were loyal and devoted servants and things like that, if you look at the inscriptions. And so again, like I only have really, I don't think it's good that they were given these gravestones necessarily. Like if you, from that perspective, like it makes me think that these young women may have, suffered a lot more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Egypt, we have maybe time for one, maybe two questions.
I don't think there's any more questions right now, but Asia, there was a lot of great comments with your presentation. I will make sure that I forward them all to you. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions.
We have one.
Okay. Did I miss anyone? Oh, I do believe Kate Ryan has her hand up. I apologize.
This is just a comment that I'm a member of First Parish, Cambridge, and I'm going to stop our egg hunt in the graveyard because it is disrespectful to these women. And I don't care what the Puritans buried there might have thought, but now I really feel like these women were alive, and I feel like we should stop the egg hunt in the graveyard.
That's funny. I kind of like the egg hunt in the graveyard.
Okay, you do? Oh no. Okay.
I am fascinated.
Yeah, I would love your opinion on this. And I know it's a very minor thing, but every year I have a total crisis of like faith over it, basically.
I mean, I don't speak for everyone, but I think it's very, okay, this is also me being like anthropology and whatever, so I might be weird. But I think it's fascinating the interaction between like the living and the dead in the space that takes place. But also, those young people who are participating, the people who are there, like there's a really good opportunity to teach them about the space they're in. I mean, like maybe you're doing this egg hunt or something, but you're like, hey, look what's written on these, gravestones. I mean, especially if you're linking it to, religion and the history of Puritanism in New England. I mean, there's some really interesting opportunities for engagement, and at least for someone like me who's very like I don't know, like tactile or likes to see material things, probably why I became an archaeologist. I thought that was really interesting. So I actually have a research assistant who's been working with us on this project, Kayla, who's actually a graduate student in the Harvard School of Design, who's interested in these sorts of landscapes. And when I told her that there's like an egg hunt in the cemetery every year, she was like, I have to go see it. Like, so it might just be a weird thing for like us who study history and landscape, but like, I don't necessarily think, and you can ask other people, obviously, I don't necessarily think being in these spaces is disrespectful. In a way, it's like, it's bringing you together. It's like bridging that gap. And it also can teach people about the importance of preserving that history. Like I would love to have been a child who grew up doing egg hunts in a cemetery. But that's me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point and a very interesting comment too, Kate. Well, Asia, thank you very much. We're going to follow you down. Asia will be leaving Boston and going down to Johns Hopkins University to do some continued research work, I believe. And so we're going to follow you down there. Certainly we'll be in touch and continue this. But thank you. This was a very interesting, you uncovered a lot. Yes.
Wonderful job, Asia.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
It really was.
It means so much. I like tell everyone, please. Okay.
Well, can you tell us how do we obtain the copy of the report that you?
So I believe
your email, please.
Oh yeah. Oh, let me put my email in chat, but also Chrissy put a link to the report in the chat, I believe.
She did, and I want to point out.
I'm sorry.
Yes, she did, and I want to point out a comment that Reverend Dan Smith said that we should think about offering a Harvard chaplain landscape of slavery tour to this group. Which I think that is a great idea, Reverend Dan.
Yes.
That would be excellent. Yes. Well, no, thank you. And there is let me just stop here as we the other night, I don't know how many Asia, thank you very much, and we certainly will continue this dialogue and
Yes.
very, very interesting. For those of you on Friday night who had an opportunity to go over to Christ Church to see the documentary that Ladada Grimes, who was here, and Jonathan Knight produced, it was excellent, was very well received. And there was one comment that I must make, which Asia, when you started out and you were referring to slavery in England, is somehow being perceived as being more benevolent, in its interaction with its slaves versus down south. However, when someone in the documentary was asked, how do they feel about General Bibby giving them freedom and giving them money, to start a new life, supposedly, the response was, well, first of all, Black people shouldn't have been enslaved in the first place. So, so that question really, in that context, was mute. I thought it was very interesting because, it just spoke to the whole issue of what the documentary was talking about. But as we pursue these these month-to-month engagements, one of the purpose, like you brought up, Asia, is to present information that has not been presented before. This is a forum where, we're just trying to bring forward individuals who have a wealth of information, like yourself, on various subjects, like the documentary that Ladada and Jonathan did. And like what we have coming up too, next month, Kiara Singleton in June will give us a tour and a presentation on the Royal House. We had an opportunity, and I say we, excuse me, Egypt, my daughter Jordan, my wife Beverly, and had an opportunity to meet Julia Royal, descendant of the royal family, and we were at Memorial Chapel at Harvard, and we went over to law school and looked at some of the documents that are there. It was a very enriching and very emotional time that we spent with Julia. Very nice person, and she's been very involved with the Royal House, which is founded, in memory of her, well, not in memory, but in memorial, I guess, of her family. So that will be in June. We're going to take a break during July and August. We're going to come back in September, and we're Sarah Naomi Bleish, who is the vice provost at Harvard and also oversees the Harvard's Legacy of Slavery program. So she'll give us an update on that. We're also going to venture into some other areas, and such as Gullah Geechee, that off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. There are islands where descendants of slaves who escaped from ships early on and set up live there within their own colonies, and they're referred to as Gullah Geechee Islands. And much of their existence is a mystery, not only to general public as well as to African Americans. And there are a couple of islands, Sapelo Island in particular, off the coast of Georgia, which we visited recently. But we want to have, bring that to the attention of everyone and have a presentation. Also, we're going to look at the Atlanta Museum. We're going to do a little switch. Atlanta Museum has a treasure trove of Confederate, artifacts and history. And we've talked about, the impact of slavery on African Americans, but there's also, through the eyes and the lenses of other people, the history of the Confederacy and their engagement in that whole process during that Civil War, and very interesting stories too. There's food. We like to venture off into the culinary aspects of the impact that, and also music, and last but not least, certainly, religion, which we're hopefully, Dan, we can work with, you and other members, Quishin and other members here in terms of trying to just bring in in the AME church to bring in a little history on how religion has played its role in the development of African American culture after emancipation. So we have a lot that we're looking forward to. We want to thank everybody who comes, our regular friends, our friends who join us, and thank you, Asia, for your support. You're wonderful, and really, really was very engaging. We do we'd like to continue this research. We do have a research assistant coming on in June because of the support of the Longfellow House. We also would like to hire a couple of other researchers and do some additional work. So, and develop our young people's program where we can go out and virtually visit existing sites like Phyllis Wheatley on Calm Ave and just give, some history on what these statues and what these memorials represent. That would probably be done on a Saturday morning, and be geared towards the young people. However,
In the tour in Washington to the museum.
yes.
To the high school students, we want to take a tour bus to Washington, D.C. with a couple high school students and of course the general public, adults.
That's to the Museum of African American History down there. So we have, a number of events and that we want to bring to the attention of the membership here through the Slave Legacy History Coalition. And having said that, we do have a little donation, down at the end if you feel, within, your hearts. Well, you can. It's through History Cambridge, and the History Cambridge handles all of the through their 501c3 fiscal agent relationship we have currently. So that information is at the bottom of our newsletter. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for being here. We look forward to seeing you next month when will be Kiara Singleton, who will give a presentation, and a tour of the Royal House in case you have not been there. And I want to say thank you to all of you for being with us again. And we look forward to, seeing you again in the future. Thank you for your support. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again, Asia.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Bye, everyone.
I know. Bye-bye.